The morning my husband looked at me across the kitchen island and called me a freeloader in front of his own mother, I remember setting down my coffee cup so carefully, so quietly, because some part of me already knew that the next sentence out of my mouth was going to change everything he thought he understood about his life, his father's company, and the woman he married. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the quiet strength of people who are underestimated, and in the idea that life has a way of handing us second chances even when we least expect them, then please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Our community here is built on stories just like this one, stories about real people, real struggles, and the redemption that waits for us on the other side of our hardest days. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. My name is Margaret Whitfield, though everyone who loves me calls me Maggie, and for 6 years I was married to a man named Grant Delacroix, a man I had once believed was the kindest person I would ever meet. When we married, Grant was a mid-level manager at his father's manufacturing company, a business called Delacroix Precision Tooling that had been built from nothing by his father, Walter Delacroix, back in the early 1980s. Walter was a widower by the time I entered the family, his wife having passed from cancer when Grant was only 22, and in the years that followed, Walter had grown quieter, more private, and strangely more attached to me than I ever expected a father-in-law to be. I used to think it was because I reminded him of his late wife's gentleness, the way she apparently used to sit with him after long days at the factory and simply listen without needing anything in return. Whatever the reason, Walter and I built something rare together, a friendship built on trust, on long afternoon conversations over tea in his sunlit study, and on a mutual understanding that family was not always about blood, but about who chose to show up for you when it mattered. Grant and I met at a charity gala for a children's hospital, back when I was working as a financial analyst at a boutique investment firm downtown. I was 31 at the time, independent, sharp with numbers, and entirely uninterested in being swept off my feet by anyone who seemed too smooth or too rehearsed. Grant was neither of those things. He was awkward in the most endearing way, spilling wine on his own shoes within the first 10 minutes of our conversation, laughing at himself so easily that I found myself laughing too, and by the end of that evening, he had asked for my number 3 separate times because he kept forgetting whether I had actually given it to him or whether he had dreamed the whole exchange. We dated for a year and a half before he proposed to me on a hiking trail overlooking a valley of autumn trees, the kind of proposal that felt like it belonged in a movie rather than in my actual life. I said yes without hesitation. I believed, with my whole heart, that I was building a future with someone who valued me as an equal partner, someone who saw my ambition and my mind as gifts rather than threats. For the first 3 years of our marriage, that belief held steady. I continued working at the investment firm, climbing steadily toward a senior analyst position, while Grant worked his way up within his father's company, learning the operations side of the business from the factory floor upward, exactly the way Walter wanted him to. Walter believed that no one should manage people they hadn't first worked alongside, and so Grant spent his early 20s learning to operate the machinery himself, understanding the suppliers, understanding the exhaustion of a 12-hour shift, before he ever sat behind a desk with authority over anyone. I respected that about the Delacroix family, the insistence that leadership be earned through understanding rather than simply inherited through blood. It was one of the reasons I fell in love with the idea of being part of this family in the first place. But somewhere around our 4th year of marriage, something in Grant began to shift, and it happened so gradually that I almost didn't notice it until it was already deeply rooted. It started with small comments. He would come home from a stressful day and mention offhandedly that it must be nice to work regular hours while he was drowning in supply chain issues, even though my hours at the investment firm were often longer than his. Then the comments became more pointed, more frequent, especially after I made the decision to leave my firm following a merger that eliminated my department entirely. I want to be honest here, because honesty matters in a story like this one. I did not immediately find new employment. I took nearly 8 months to search for the right position, partly because severance had given us a financial cushion, and partly because I was exhausted in a way that went beyond simple tiredness, the kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing your career had been built on a foundation that could collapse overnight through no fault of your own. During those 8 months, I did what I could to keep our household running. I managed our finances meticulously, I cooked nearly every meal, I handled the renovations on our home, I organized our lives in ways that Grant never seemed to notice or acknowledge. But somewhere in his mind, a narrative had begun to form, a narrative that painted me not as a partner navigating a difficult season, but as a burden he was carrying. The truth is, Grant had begun spending an increasing amount of time with a group of colleagues from the company, several of whom had wives who did not work outside the home by choice, wives who managed households in a very different rhythm than I did, and I began to notice him comparing me to them in ways that felt less like observations and more like accusations. He would mention how one of his colleagues' wives had a full dinner ready every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, how she never seemed stressed, how she seemed grateful simply to be provided for. I remember sitting across from him during one of these conversations, feeling something cold settle into my stomach, because I understood, even then, that what he admired about her situation was not her happiness, but her compliance, her lack of ambition that might inconvenience him. It was around this time that Walter's health began to decline. Nothing dramatic at first, just a slower gait, a tremor in his hands that made his morning tea more difficult to manage, small signs of a body beginning to wear down after 7 decades of hard work. Walter had never remarried, had never had children beyond Grant, and as his health declined, he began speaking to me more and more about the future of the company, about his fears that Grant, despite his diligence, lacked the emotional intelligence and long-term vision needed to steer Delacroix Precision Tooling through the difficult economic transitions the manufacturing sector was beginning to face. I did not take these conversations lightly. I listened, I asked questions, I offered my professional insight where it seemed welcome, drawing on my years of financial analysis to help Walter think through restructuring options, diversification strategies, and succession planning that could protect the 400 and some employees who depended on that company for their livelihoods. What Grant did not know, what I chose not to share with him during those years, was that Walter had begun quietly restructuring the ownership of the company. This was not some sudden, dramatic decision made in secret to spite his son. It was the culmination of nearly 2 years of careful legal and financial planning, guided by Walter's genuine belief that the company needed a steady hand that understood both the emotional weight of legacy and the cold logic of sustainable business decisions. Walter had watched me navigate our family's finances with precision even during the hardest months of my unemployment. He had watched me treat his aging body and his declining confidence with patience rather than pity. He had watched me show up to family dinners, to hospital visits when his own knee surgery required recovery, to quiet Sunday afternoons when Grant was too busy or too disinterested to sit with his own father, and Walter decided, in his own quiet and deliberate way, that I deserved to be protected, that I deserved a stake in the future of something I had helped nurture even when no one was watching. The paperwork was finalized 18 months before the morning Grant called me a freeloader. Walter had transferred 45% ownership of Delacroix Precision Tooling into a trust with my name attached as primary beneficiary and voting proxy, while he retained 30% for himself and allocated the remaining 25% to Grant, with the understanding that Grant's shares would only reach full voting power once certain leadership benchmarks were met, benchmarks that Walter had designed specifically to ensure his son grew into the kind of leader the company genuinely needed. Walter asked me, during the signing of these documents in his lawyer's quiet office one autumn afternoon, whether I wanted Grant to know immediately. I told him honestly that I did not know what the right answer was, that I worried about how such news might affect our marriage, might make Grant feel diminished in front of his own wife, might create a wound between father and son that could never fully heal. Walter, in his wisdom, suggested we wait, that timing mattered, that revealing this kind of truth needed to happen naturally, organically, when the moment called for it rather than being forced into an argument or used as a weapon. I agreed, and so for 1.5 years, I carried this knowledge quietly, not out of deception, but out of respect for a family I loved and a marriage I was still fighting to protect. During that 1.5 years, my marriage continued its slow erosion. Grant's comments grew sharper, more frequent, more public. He began making jokes at dinner parties about how he was fortunate his salary could support both of us, jokes that landed with an edge sharp enough to draw blood even as the room laughed along politely. I found new employment eventually, taking a position as a financial consultant for smaller manufacturing firms, work that paid less than my previous position but that gave me flexibility to continue supporting Walter through his health struggles. Grant never asked about my new job with any real curiosity. He never asked what my days looked like, what challenges I faced, what small victories I celebrated. Our conversations became transactional, logistics about bills and schedules and whose turn it was to handle which household task, and I found myself grieving a marriage that was still technically alive but that had lost whatever spark of genuine partnership it once contained. The morning everything changed began like any other. Walter had asked Grant and me to come to the house for what he described as a family breakfast, something he had been doing more frequently in recent months as his health continued its slow decline and he seemed to want to gather the people he loved around him whenever he could. Grant's mother had passed away years before I entered the picture, but Grant's aunt, Walter's younger sister, a sharp-tongued but ultimately warm woman named Constance, had also been invited, along with Walter's longtime family attorney, a soft-spoken man named Dennis Abernathy who had handled the Delacroix family's legal affairs for over 2 decades. I remember feeling a flutter of nervousness that morning, though I did not yet understand why, only that something in the air felt different, felt weighted with an importance I could not name. We arrived at Walter's house, a modest but elegant colonial on the edge of town that he had refused to sell despite Grant's repeated suggestions that he downsize into something more manageable for a man his age. The morning light came through the kitchen windows in soft golden streams, illuminating the same wooden table where I had shared countless cups of tea with Walter over the years, where we had discussed everything from quarterly earnings reports to his late wife's recipe for apple preserves. Constance was already seated when we arrived, sipping black coffee with the kind of composed patience that suggested she, too, sensed something significant was about to unfold. Dennis Abernathy arrived shortly after us, carrying a leather folder that he set carefully on the counter, and I noticed Grant's eyes narrow slightly at the sight of it, though he said nothing, perhaps assuming it had to do with routine estate paperwork that Walter periodically wanted reviewed. We ate breakfast together, and it was during this meal, this ordinary meal of scrambled eggs and toast and fresh orange juice, that Grant made the comment that would unravel everything. He had been discussing a difficult week at the factory, a supplier issue that had delayed a major shipment, and in the middle of his frustration, he turned to me and said, with a casualness that somehow made the words even more devastating, that he wished he had the luxury of coasting through life the way I did, that some people got to be freeloaders while others carried the weight of entire companies on their shoulders. The word freeloader hung in the air like a struck bell, and I watched Walter's face change, watched something harden behind his eyes that I had rarely seen in all the years I had known him. I did not respond immediately. I had learned, over the years of our marriage, that responding to Grant's comments in the heat of the moment rarely accomplished anything productive. Instead, I set down my coffee cup carefully, deliberately, and I looked at my husband with a calm that surprised even me, and I asked him if he truly believed that I had contributed nothing of value to our lives together or to this family. Grant, perhaps sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere but still too caught up in his own frustration to recognize the danger of the moment, doubled down, listing the ways he felt burdened, the ways he felt he alone had carried the responsibility of providing, of building, of maintaining the family legacy while I, in his words, simply existed alongside him without truly earning my place. It was Walter who spoke next, and his voice, though quiet, carried a weight that silenced the room instantly. He asked Grant to repeat what he had just said, and when Grant, flustered but stubborn, repeated a version of the same sentiment, Walter set down his own fork and asked Dennis Abernathy to open the folder he had brought. I remember my heart pounding in that moment, not from excitement, but from a genuine uncertainty about how this revelation would land, about whether it would heal something in our family or shatter it beyond repair. Dennis opened the folder and began explaining, in the careful, measured language of a lawyer accustomed to delivering significant news, the restructuring of Delacroix Precision Tooling's ownership that had taken place 18 months prior. He explained that 45% of the company's shares had been placed in a trust with Margaret Whitfield Delacroix as the primary beneficiary and voting proxy, that this decision had been made by Walter after careful consideration of the contributions, character, and capability demonstrated by each member of the family over the preceding years. Grant's face, I will never forget it, moved through an entire spectrum of emotion within the span of perhaps 30 seconds. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like anger, quickly followed by a dawning horror as the reality of what he had just said, in front of his father, in front of his aunt, in front of the woman who apparently owned nearly half of the company he had spent his entire adult life trying to prove himself worthy of leading, settled into his understanding. He looked at me, and I watched him search my face for some sign that this was a joke, some indication that the ground beneath him was not actually shifting as dramatically as it appeared to be, and when he found no such reassurance, he simply sat back in his chair, his mouth slightly open, no words emerging for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a handful of seconds. Walter, in that moment, did something I had not expected. He did not gloat, did not use this revelation as an opportunity to punish his son for years of dismissive behavior toward me. Instead, he spoke gently, explaining that his decision had never been about diminishing Grant, but about ensuring the company's survival and success through the contributions of everyone who had genuinely invested in its future, including a daughter-in-law who had shown more consistent care, wisdom, and dedication to this family's well-being than Walter had perhaps ever fully articulated. He told Grant, in front of all of us, that he loved him, that he had always believed in his capacity to grow into the leader the company needed, but that growth required humility, required the willingness to see the people around you clearly rather than through the distorted lens of insecurity and comparison. I want to pause here and ask you, if this story is resonating with you, if you have ever felt undervalued by someone who was supposed to see your worth most clearly, to leave a comment sharing a moment when you finally felt truly seen. Your stories matter to our community here, and I read every single one of them. The days that followed that breakfast were among the most difficult of my marriage. Grant did not speak to me for nearly 72 hours, choosing instead to stay late at the factory, sleeping in the guest room when he finally did come home, moving through our house like a ghost caught between shame and resentment. I gave him the space he seemed to need, though I will admit that those 3 days were agonizing for me as well, filled with a strange cocktail of vindication and heartbreak, because even though I finally had proof, undeniable and legally binding proof, that I was valued by someone in this family, the person whose validation I had actually craved all along, my own husband, still could not seem to find his way to genuine acknowledgement of my worth. On the 4th day, Grant came to me in our kitchen, the same kitchen where he had called me a freeloader in front of his mother figure and family attorney, though this time it was just the two of us, morning light streaming through the same windows, and he asked if we could talk. I agreed, cautiously, unsure of what version of my husband I would be speaking with. What emerged over the next 2 hours was not a defense, not an attempt to minimize what he had said or done, but something closer to a genuine reckoning. Grant told me that he had spent the last 3 days replaying not just that breakfast conversation, but years of conversations, years of comments he had made, moments he had dismissed my contributions or made me feel small in front of others, and that the weight of this pattern, once he finally allowed himself to see it clearly, had been suffocating. He told me about his own insecurities, ones he had never fully articulated to me during our 6 years of marriage, insecurities rooted in growing up as the only child of a father who built an empire from nothing, a father whose shadow felt impossible to step out from under no matter how many years Grant spent proving himself on the factory floor. He confessed that watching me navigate my career, my unemployment, and my subsequent consulting work with what appeared to be effortless competence had triggered something ugly in him, a fear that he was somehow less capable, less valuable, less deserving of the legacy he had been raised to inherit. Rather than confronting these fears honestly, he had projected them onto me, transforming his own insecurity into criticism of my contributions, convincing himself that diminishing me somehow elevated his own sense of worth. I listened to all of this without interrupting, and I want to be honest with you, watching this audience of ours, that listening did not erase the pain of those years, did not immediately restore the trust that had eroded conversation by conversation, comment by comment. But I recognized something genuine in his words, a rawness that felt different from his previous attempts to smooth over conflict with surface-level apologies. When he finished speaking, I asked him the question that had been sitting in my chest for years, whether he actually loved me, or whether he had simply grown comfortable with the idea of me, mistaking familiarity for genuine partnership. He did not answer immediately, and I respected that hesitation more than I would have respected a quick reassurance, because it told me he was actually considering the question rather than simply saying what he thought I wanted to hear. He told me, eventually, that he did love me, that he had always loved me, but that somewhere along the way he had stopped treating that love as something requiring active care and attention, had instead let it calcify into assumption, into the kind of complacency that mistakes a partner's steadiness for an inexhaustible resource rather than a living, breathing person with her own needs and her own capacity for hurt. I told him that love without respect was not really love at all, that I could not continue building a life with someone who saw my presence in his life as a burden to be tolerated rather than a gift to be cherished. I told him that the ownership stake Walter had given me was not a weapon I intended to wield against him, was never meant to be a source of shame or humiliation, but that it had inadvertently revealed something true about how differently his father and I saw my worth compared to how he had been seeing it. What followed was not an instant transformation, because real change rarely happens instantly no matter how compelling the moment of reckoning. Grant began attending individual therapy, something he had resisted for years despite my gentle suggestions, and he asked, humbly, whether I would be willing to attend couples counseling with him, not as a formality to check off before deciding whether to end our marriage, but as a genuine attempt to rebuild something that had been damaged. I agreed, cautiously, because I still loved him despite everything, still remembered the man who had spilled wine on his own shoes at a charity gala and made me laugh until my cheeks hurt, still believed that people were capable of growth even when they had spent years failing to demonstrate it. Our therapy sessions over the following months were not easy. Our therapist, a thoughtful woman named Priscilla Hartwood, pushed both of us to examine patterns we had allowed to become normalized within our marriage, patterns of dismissal on his part and patterns of quiet accommodation on mine that had allowed his behavior to continue unchecked for far too long. I learned, through this process, that my own tendency to absorb criticism without pushing back, to prioritize keeping the peace over demanding to be heard, had inadvertently created space for Grant's insecurities to metastasize into cruelty. This was not an excuse for his behavior, Priscilla was clear about that, responsibility for his words and actions rested entirely with him, but understanding the dynamic helped me recognize changes I also needed to make if we were going to build something healthier moving forward. During this same period, Walter's health continued its gradual decline, though he remained sharp mentally, still attending board meetings, still offering guidance to the management team, still finding joy in his Sunday afternoon teas even as his body grew increasingly frail. I spent more time with him during these months, not because of any obligation tied to my ownership stake, but because our friendship had only deepened through the crisis that had unfolded, because Walter had shown me, through his quiet act of foresight and protection, that he saw me not as an extension of his son's life but as an individual worthy of respect and security in her own right. During one of our afternoon teas, several months after that fateful breakfast, Walter told me something that has stayed with me ever since. He said that he had not given me those shares to punish Grant or to prove a point about who deserved credit for the company's success. He had given me those shares because he had watched me show up, consistently, quietly, without seeking recognition, for a family that had not always treated me with the respect I deserved, and he wanted me to know, in a way that could never be taken away or dismissed, that my contributions mattered, that I mattered. Grant's growth, when it finally began to take root genuinely rather than performatively, manifested in small but meaningful ways. He began asking me about my consulting work with real curiosity, remembering details of my clients and challenges I had mentioned weeks prior, showing an interest that felt qualitatively different from his previous polite but disinterested nods. He began taking on more responsibility for household tasks he had previously assumed were simply mine to manage, not because I demanded it, but because he seemed to genuinely want to demonstrate, through action rather than words alone, that he understood partnership meant shared labor rather than assumed obligation. He apologized, not just once in that initial kitchen conversation, but repeatedly over the following months, in different contexts, as he continued to recognize new layers of his previous behavior that deserved acknowledgement. The most significant shift, perhaps, came nearly 8 months after that breakfast, when Grant approached his father and asked to formally discuss the leadership benchmarks Walter had established for his full ownership stake to vest. Rather than resenting these benchmarks or viewing them as obstacles imposed by a father who doubted him, Grant approached the conversation with genuine curiosity about what specifically Walter believed he needed to develop as a leader. This conversation, which I was not present for but which Grant later described to me in detail, marked a turning point in his relationship with his father as well, transforming what had been years of quiet tension and unspoken expectations into an open dialogue about growth, legacy, and what it truly meant to lead an organization that hundreds of families depended upon for their livelihoods. Walter told Grant, during this conversation, about specific moments over the years when he had watched Grant dismiss or overlook my contributions, moments Grant had not even realized his father had witnessed, small comments at family gatherings, subtle dismissals during business discussions where I had offered financial insight that Grant had brushed aside only to see the same insight validated weeks later by an outside consultant. Walter explained that leadership required the humility to recognize value regardless of its source, the wisdom to see people clearly rather than through the lens of ego or insecurity, and that these were not skills that could simply be inherited through bloodline but had to be cultivated through genuine self-reflection and growth. Grant, to his credit, absorbed this feedback without defensiveness, recognizing in his father's words a mirror of the same conversations he and I had been having in our own therapy sessions. As the months progressed into nearly a year since that fateful breakfast, I began to notice genuine shifts in how Grant carried himself, not just within our marriage but within his role at the company as well. He began actively seeking my professional input on financial matters, not as a token gesture but as genuine consultation, incorporating my analysis into presentations he made to the board, crediting me openly for insights I contributed rather than absorbing them silently as his own ideas the way he had done in the early years of our marriage without me even fully realizing it was happening. Our marriage, which had felt like a slow leak for years, began to feel like it was actually being repaired, plank by plank, conversation by conversation, apology by genuine apology. I want to share something with you now, something that I think matters most in this story, which is that forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, and it is not the same as pretending harm never occurred. I did not forgive Grant because the revelation of my ownership stake gave me some kind of power over him that made forgiveness easy or obvious. I forgave him because, over time, through consistent effort and genuine accountability, he demonstrated that the man who had called me a freeloader was not the entirety of who he was, but rather a manifestation of insecurities he had never learned to confront honestly. Forgiveness, in our case, was not a single decision made in a moment of emotional vulnerability, but an ongoing choice I continued to make as I watched him do the difficult, humbling work of becoming someone worthy of the partnership I had always hoped our marriage could be. There were setbacks along the way, moments when old patterns resurfaced, when stress from the factory or frustration from a difficult board meeting would cause Grant to slip back into old habits of dismissiveness or defensiveness. But what differed now was his willingness to recognize these slips quickly, to acknowledge them without excessive self-flagellation but also without minimizing their impact, and to course-correct in ways that demonstrated genuine internalized growth rather than performative apology aimed at avoiding conflict. Priscilla, our therapist, often reminded us that healthy relationships were not defined by the absence of mistakes but by the presence of genuine repair, and watching Grant learn to repair rather than simply avoid or deflect became, for me, one of the most meaningful transformations I witnessed during that year. Walter's health took a more serious turn during the autumn of that year, nearly 14 months after the breakfast that had changed everything. He was hospitalized briefly for complications related to his heart, and during those tense days in the hospital waiting room, Grant and I sat together, hand in hand, in a way that felt different from the performative unity we might have displayed in earlier years of our marriage. This felt like genuine partnership, two people bracing themselves together against a shared fear, drawing strength from each other rather than simply existing in parallel isolation. Walter recovered from that particular health scare, though it served as a sobering reminder to all of us that time was not infinite, that whatever repair work needed to happen within our family needed to happen with urgency rather than complacency. During Walter's recovery, he called Grant and me to his bedside one afternoon, the sunlight filtering through his hospital room window in soft golden patterns across the white blankets, and he told us both that watching our marriage heal over the past year had been one of the great joys of his final years, that he had worried, during the darkest days following that breakfast revelation, that his decision to protect me through the ownership trust might have inadvertently destroyed his sons. Marriage rather than protecting a woman he had come to love as a daughter. Seeing us sitting together now, holding hands, genuinely present with each other rather than simply performing togetherness for his benefit, gave him a peace he had not expected to feel at this stage of his life. It was during this same hospital visit that Walter shared something else with us, a piece of his own history that he had never fully disclosed before. He told us about his own marriage to Grant's mother, about years early in their partnership when he, too, had struggled with insecurity, when the pressure of building a company from nothing had made him distant, dismissive, prone to overlooking his wife's contributions to their shared life in favor of his own anxieties about proving himself as a provider. He told us that his wife had nearly left him during their 5th year of marriage, that it had taken a painful and humbling period of reflection for him to recognize the ways he had failed to see her as a full partner rather than simply someone who supported his ambitions from the sidelines. This confession, offered so vulnerably from a man who had always seemed unshakably composed to me, helped both Grant and me understand that the patterns we had been fighting against were not unique to us, were not evidence of some fundamental flaw in Grant's character, but were instead common human failures that required conscious, continuous effort to overcome. If you have made it this far in our story today, I want to ask you to pause for just a moment and think about the relationships in your own life where you might need to offer someone the grace of a second chance, or perhaps the courage to ask for one yourself. Leave a comment below sharing what this story has made you reflect on, because these conversations, these moments of shared reflection within our community, are exactly why we do what we do here on this channel. As the following year unfolded, Grant formally met the leadership benchmarks his father had established, not through some dramatic singular achievement, but through sustained demonstration of the qualities Walter had been hoping to cultivate: patience with employees during a difficult union negotiation, humility in seeking outside consultation when the company faced a challenging pivot toward more sustainable manufacturing practices, and perhaps most significantly, genuine partnership with me. As he navigated these professional challenges, seeking my financial expertise not as an afterthought but as a core component of his decision-making process. Walter formally transferred full voting power of Grant's 25% stake during a small family ceremony at his house, the same kitchen table where so much had unfolded over the preceding 2 years, and I remember watching Grant's eyes fill with tears as his father embraced him, not because of the financial significance of the transfer, but because of what it represented: a father's belief that his son had genuinely grown into the man he always hoped he would become. My own relationship with the company evolved during this period as well. Rather than remaining a passive holder of shares, I became increasingly involved in strategic planning, using my background in financial analysis to help guide Delacroix Precision Tooling through a challenging period of industry transition as manufacturing technologies rapidly evolved and smaller companies struggled to compete with automation-heavy competitors. Grant and I began working together in a genuinely collaborative way, my analytical strengths complementing his operational knowledge and his growing leadership maturity, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were building something together rather than simply coexisting within the same household. This is not to say that every difficulty in our marriage evaporated once Grant demonstrated growth and once the company's ownership structure was fully settled. Marriage, even a healing one, remains complicated, remains a daily practice of choosing each other despite imperfection, despite the inevitable friction that comes from two people building a shared life. But the fundamental foundation had shifted. I no longer felt like an afterthought in my own home, no longer felt like my contributions were invisible or undervalued, no longer felt the particular loneliness of being married to someone who saw me as a burden rather than a partner. Grant, for his part, seemed genuinely lighter, freed from the exhausting performance of insecurity-driven superiority he had unconsciously maintained for years, able instead to simply be present with me, curious about my life, invested in my well-being in ways that felt authentic rather than obligatory. Nearly 2 years after that fateful breakfast, Walter passed away peacefully in his sleep, having lived to see his son become the kind of leader and husband he always believed Grant was capable of becoming. The funeral was a quiet, dignified affair, attended by hundreds of employees whose lives had been touched by Walter's decades of leadership, by Constance and other family members, by business partners and community members who had known Walter as a man of integrity and quiet generosity. Grant delivered a eulogy that day that spoke not just to his father's business acumen, but to the lessons of humility and love that Walter had taught him during the final years of his life, lessons that Grant openly credited with saving his marriage and transforming him into a better man, husband, and leader. I sat in the front pew that day, holding Grant's hand as he spoke, feeling a complicated mixture of grief for the loss of a man who had become like a father to me and profound gratitude for the gift he had given me, not simply the ownership stake in a company, but the gift of being truly seen, truly valued, at a moment in my life when I desperately needed that validation. In the years since Walter's passing, Grant and I have continued building our life together, now co-leading Delacroix Precision Tooling as genuine partners, our combined ownership stake representing not just financial security but a testament to the kind of marriage we ultimately built out of the wreckage of those early painful years. We have expanded the company's operations into more sustainable manufacturing practices, guided by the same values of integrity and long-term thinking that Walter instilled in both of us. We speak now, openly and without shame, about the difficult early years of our marriage, about the painful breakfast that changed everything, believing that our story might offer hope to others navigating similar struggles, others who might be sitting in a marriage where they feel undervalued, unseen, uncertain whether the person they love is capable of the growth necessary to build something healthier. I think often about that morning, about the calm with which I set down my coffee cup before responding to Grant's cruel comment, about how close I came, in that moment, to simply accepting the label he had placed upon me, to internalizing the idea that my worth was measured only by visible, quantifiable contribution rather than the countless invisible ways I had shown up for our family over the years. I think about how easily that morning could have gone differently, how Walter's revelation could have shattered our marriage entirely rather than becoming the painful catalyst for genuine transformation. I do not believe that every marriage facing similar dysfunction will find its way to the same resolution we found. Some relationships, despite genuine effort, cannot overcome the damage that has been done, and I want to honor that reality rather than suggesting that forgiveness and reconciliation are always the right or possible path forward. But for us, for Grant and me, that painful morning became the unlikely beginning of a marriage far healthier and more genuine than the one that had slowly been eroding in the years prior. If this story has touched your heart today, if it has reminded you of the importance of seeing the people we love clearly, of recognizing contributions that are not always visible or easily measured, I want to ask you to take a moment right now to like this video, leave a meaningful comment sharing your own reflections, share this story with someone in your life who might need a reminder of hope today, and subscribe to our channel so that you never miss another story of resilience, forgiveness, and the possibility of second chances that our community shares here together. Before you go, I would love for you to leave a comment telling us about a moment in your own life when you felt truly seen by someone, or perhaps a moment when you learned to truly see someone else more clearly than you had before, because these are the stories, the lessons, the reminders of our shared humanity, that make this community what it is. Grant and I recently celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary, and during the small dinner we hosted with close family and friends, Grant stood to offer a toast, and rather than the polished, somewhat detached words he might have offered in our earlier years together, he spoke instead about gratitude, about the humbling gift of being loved by someone who chose to stay and fight for our marriage even when he had given her every reason to walk away. He spoke about his father's wisdom, about the painful but necessary lesson that true partnership requires seeing the people we love not as extensions of our own ego or ambition, but as complete individuals whose worth exists entirely independent of how visibly or conventionally they contribute to a shared life. I sat there that evening, surrounded by people who loved us, watching my husband speak with a vulnerability and genuine emotion that the man I had married a decade earlier would have found nearly impossible to access, and I felt, for the first time in many years, a complete and settled peace about the life we had built together. The company continues to thrive under our joint leadership, having weathered the industry's technological transitions with a stability that Walter would have been proud of, providing steady employment for the same families who had depended on Delacroix Precision Tooling for generations. But more than the company's success, more than the financial security that ownership stake once revealed so dramatically in that kitchen years ago, what I treasure most is the marriage Grant and I painstakingly rebuilt from the ashes of his cruel words that morning. I share our story now, not to shame my husband for the man he once was, but to honor the man he chose to become, and to remind anyone listening today that people are capable of profound growth when they are willing to look honestly at their own failures, when they are met with both accountability and grace, and when they genuinely choose, day after day, to become better partners to the people who love them. Our family, our community here on this channel, and the lessons we continue to learn together about forgiveness, growth, and the quiet power of being truly seen, are the reasons I wanted to share this story with all of you today, and I hope it brings you the same hope and healing that living through it eventually brought to me.